Hola.
Hello, Dave. Where are you, my friend?
I'm just at home in the basement. I got my baby with me.
So you are just looking at me. Let me see. Do you have any of you the people around? So you are alone. Can we say hello?
Fantastic. Hello, everyone. Hola.
Hey, Dave, thank you for your time.
Okay, so my name's Dave Crossland, and I work as an operations manager on the Google Fonts team. But this presentation is not about Google Fonts and is not a sort of official company thing. I'm obviously speaking on behalf of the of Google as an employee, but the presentation is not about Google Fonts. Instead, I want to talk about the topic of variable fonts, color fonts, the new fonts technologies, and I want to start by telling you a story about the first computer which I had at home as a child. This was the Commodore Amiga 600. It was the first computer with a hard disk that you could buy built in England, where I was born. And I want to tell you about an incident that changed my life. My father worked away from the home, and he was going away for a few weeks. And he told me, "Don't break the computer. If you break it, then no one can fix it. It will be broken." So sure enough, after a week, I broke it. I managed to delete all the files on the hard disk. And so my mother told me, I was very upset. My mother told me, "Well, the computer comes with a manual. You can read this manual book, and you can figure out how to fix it. And you've got 5 weeks to do it." So indeed, I did. Sat down and I read the books, and I learned what I'd done wrong and how to fix it. And so that kind of set me down a path of loving to learn about computers and solving problems. So here's fonts.google.com today, and you can see we have this little check mark to show only variable fonts. And recently, we now also have color fonts, so you can see only the color fonts. We also have a large section of the website dedicated to the Noto project, which is one of the largest font projects, I think maybe of all time, and is a set of fonts for all the writing systems in the Unicode standard. And so, yeah, it's a very big project. We also recently have added this section of the website, Google Fonts Knowledge, which is a sort of textbook of typography, so that as people who come across these fonts can know better how to use them. So we have these variable fonts, and there's been a couple of important font releases. So the first variable font I want to show you today is Roboto Serif, and I'm going to play a video, and that's the introduction to it, and I'm going to try and help my baby while we watch it. So yeah, so that's the Roboto Serif font family. And then in addition, we have the Roboto Flex font family, which was updated version. Oops. So we have the Roboto Flex font family, which is the upgrade of the classic Roboto font family to this new variable fonts format. And again, we have a little video to introduce it. All right. So yeah, there's a couple more variable fonts that I want to highlight for you. So Recursive is a sans serif design that can transform into a kind of brush script kind of calligraphic font, and also a monospace sans serif. And so the recursive.design website has this sort of cube you can spin around and see those three different kinds of typefaces, which are all brought into one. And as you scroll down, you can see the classic kind of sliders that allow you to, make the typeface monospace, to make the typeface shift to being a sort of casual calligraphic font, which you can also slant over. And of course, you have control over the font weight throughout all of those three kind of different typefaces that are brought together. And then another typeface that I want to highlight is the Francis typeface, which is a sort of old style serif design, and is very different in flavor to Roboto serif, and it kind of keys into some of that kind of 1970s thank you for shopping with us kind of lettering from the typeface Bookman Swash. And so here you have these kind of expressive axes where you can make the typeface become much more soft or much more sharp. And then you can also control some of its kind of wonky features. So you see, for example, the stem of the N here can be turned wonky, give it a bit of a slant. And so a key idea throughout Roboto Serif, Roboto Flex, and Francis is this idea of optical size, which is to say that as the size of the typeface gets smaller, the letter forms change. And so you can see here, this is how they change as they get smaller. They get more widely spaced, the details become larger, and eventually the wonkiness gets turned off, because at small sizes for reading, you don't want that sort of display affectation. So as with all fonts in Google Fonts, these fonts are available under a free Libra license, which means that anyone in the world can pick them up, use them, inspect how they are made with source files, redistribute them, and even make changes. So the process, that the tool that's used for making these kinds of discussions and contributions is GitHub. And so here's an example of somebody, who had experienced a problem with the Francis fonts and has reported it, on the issue tracker. And so as we're dealing with these new font technologies, then often, details, can be overlooked, or there can be problems with the technology. So this ability to work together with a type designer, I think is very important when we're looking at these new font technologies being introduced into the industry. So the next typeface I want to show you is Nabla. And this is one of these color fonts, which the Google Fonts team has commissioned. In this case, from Arthur Reindeers Volmer and Just van Rossum, two Dutch designers. And this is, yes, Clara, this is not only a color font, but also a variable font. And so you can see here on the Google Fonts page, Type Tester, that we have an axis to control the edge highlighting and the extrusion depth, in the same way that you can control other details of a non-color font. So I think this is a key benefit of the new color fonts format, that the variations and color can be used together. All right, so that's a quick introduction to some of the recent typefaces, which I think are sort of notable. I'm sorry, Clara. And so now I want to maybe get rid of this baby. I'll be back in a minute. All right, so I wanted to first talk a little bit about David Ogilvy, who's a famous British advertising person. He was, a sort of big name in the advertising scene in the middle of the 20th century. And one of his things he was famous for was the big idea. When you advertise a product, he said, try and find out like one of the most sort of exciting, interesting things about that product, something that maybe is something of a surprise, and build the whole advertising campaign around that. So with that in mind, Marshall McLuhan is a media theorist, and he had this sort of big idea: the medium is the message. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the ideas in that book, called Medium is the Massage, which is a small book that's sort of very highly graphic. It's a very graphical book, which conveys some of these key ideas of Marshall McLuhan. And so essentially, the sort of key definition of his work is this idea of thinking of technology as a medium. And he says all media work over us completely. They are pervasive in personal, political, economic, aesthetic, psychological, moral, ethical, social consequences. They leave no part of us untouched. And so all media are extensions of some human faculty, psychic or physical. And this is a way of thinking about new technologies as they're introduced, not in terms of the messages that the technology carries, but in terms of the sort of the nature or the attributes of the technology itself. And so another key idea is this idea that when we're faced with a totally new situation, we tend to attach ourselves to the flavor of the past. We look at the present through a rearview mirror. We march backwards into the future. This idea that when we get a new technology, we use it to mimic the most close previous technology. And so I really feel that that's very relevant to the current situation in typography, where we have these new font technologies, and initially they are used to mimic the previous font technologies. And so Simon Cozens is a British type designer and technologist. And on his blog, simoncozens.github.io, he recently made a post about the Color V1 color font format. And in the blog post, he talks about how the format works, how it uses a sort of painting metaphor to paint different pieces of glyphs together. He then has this section of thinking about what that could mean for variable fonts. And he has this idea he calls masterless design, a new way of thinking about how to develop variable fonts that is not exactly using masters as they were before variable fonts, but in a new way. And he has a little demo web application font editor, so you could play around with that concept yourself. And so going back to Marshall McLuhan's book, one of his, I think, key points here is about the role of the expert and the amateur. McLuhan wrote, "The expert is the man who stays put." This idea that experts, have things that they know, and that can limit their thinking, whereas someone who's an amateur, who's just playing around, may be more open to new ways of doing things. McLuhan also has this great quote in the book from Socrates, that the discovery of the alphabet will create forgetfulness in learners' souls because they will not use their memories anymore. And I thought this was, kind of, very funny. But this idea that as we introduce new technologies, there's always a kind of Luddite idea, a rejection of the new technologies, a sense that there was nothing wrong with the way it was before. And so I think, clearly that has many thousand years of history, that attitude. So for the next section of the talk, I want to talk a little bit about this idea that Marshall McLuhan had, that when information is brushed against information, the results are startling and effective. The perennial quest for involvement and fill-in takes many forms. So switching gears to another sort of key person, a key idea, I want to talk a little bit about Richard Stallman. So Richard Stallman is a sort of famous programmer who has sort of really been key to this idea of free Libra software, not just software, but encyclopedias, textbooks, software manuals, and indeed fonts. And so his work started because he had this experience in the late 70s with the Xerox laser printer. And he was working as a programmer, and the previous kind of printer he had was often jamming. So he added a little feature to the printer so that when it jammed, it would send a message to all of the users on the local network to say, hey, the printer's jammed. Can somebody walk over there and take the paper out and unjam the printer? So when this new laser printer was introduced to his computer lab, he wanted to add that same feature. But when he spoke to people at Xerox, he was told, no, you're not allowed to see the source code. You're not allowed to make changes. And so this made him very angry. And he's been on this sort of mission for the last nearly 40 years to develop a complete set of software that everyone who obtains a copy can modify it. They have the source code and the right to make the changes that they would like to do. So he had made this definition of what it would mean for software to be free Libra. And so there's these four things: the freedom to run the program for any purpose, the freedom to study how the program works and change it so it does your computing as you wish. And you need source code to do that. And I think he has this funny phrase that if you have the source code and the right to change it, then you are in control of your computer. And when you don't have that, your computer is kind of in control of you. The third thing would be to be free to redistribute copies, so you can help out your friend and neighbor. And then the fourth thing is the combination of that second and third thing to be able to make modifications and distribute them to others. So this is, a little bit of a joke. It's an old joke. I didn't know it until very recently. But in 1941, during the Second World War, there was a speech given by the USA president, and he gave this sort of speech about these four fundamental freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. And so the free software edition is kind of a joke, and certainly we can talk about other kinds of freedoms perhaps, but these four are pretty fundamental. So from my experience, when I was a graphic design student, I was interested in using free Libre software to do graphic design and typography, but there were very few free Libre fonts available. And often the fonts that I was using would have problems. And I was not in a position where I had the source files, nor the permission, the right to make the changes that I wanted. And so this is something I think that it becomes very important when we're dealing with these new kinds of fonts, that if there's a problem with the font because it's in this new technology, of course you can discuss on GitHub, you can file an issue, you can ask the original designer to make a fix, but they may not be able to, and it may be much more important for you to be able to make that fix when at the time that you need it. If you can't make the fix yourself, you may be able to contact somebody, maybe local to you, maybe so if someone in the room right now, you could reach out to them and say, hey, I've got this font and it's under a free Libre license and I need this change made. Can you make this change for me? And if you're in business, you can say, this is for a client project and I will, pay you to do this work. So I think that's really, why having Libre fonts is important for new technologies. Okay, so I want to start wrapping up a little bit by talking about a couple of projects. So the Lexend fonts are a variable font project, which is intended for a very practical usage. It's this idea that if you can adjust the spacing and the width of a typeface together, we call that concept hyper expansion, then you can improve the reading fluency, the reading speed. And so you can see here, you've got these different versions of Lexend, which are getting wider, getting more widely spaced. And as a variable font, then this can be on a variation axis. And so you can see here, as I move the axis, the whole typeface is getting hyper expanded. And scientific studies are showing that indeed this kind of intervention, this kind of change can be effective for lots of different kinds of readers. And so this kind of practical usage of the technology is of course something that you could do before variable fonts, where you would have, 5 or 6 different versions. But with a variable font, then by having that smooth slider, each individual can dial in the exact amount of change that is going to work best for them as an individual. Now, as with any intervention, with any new technology, this change can be disruptive. Marshall McLuhan had this great quote that the major advances in civilization are processes that all but wreck the societies in which they occur. And so to wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about a concern that people have when looking at new technologies. Another funny Marshall McLuhan quote: "Come into my parlor," said the computer to the specialist. Now, as I said, Marshall McLuhan, David Ogilvy, these were folks who were writing in the middle of the 20th century. This book is from the 1960s. So this concern has always been there. And going back to Socrates, people have had a kind of Luddite attitude. But still, I think, looking at the latest technologies today is quite interesting. And so just a month ago, I saw this tweet, someone announcing that they had taken the latest advances in artificial intelligence and plugged that together with a word processor. And so the idea is you just press plus plus plus. When you type plus plus plus, it's just going to generate more text based on the text that you've written. And so you can sort of see this in action here. So it says generate some counter arguments to the above, and then the computer's running, and then boom, it's generating text with counter arguments to what you'd written above. It's pretty wild. And so he was really surprised, the programmer, that the text generator can have something useful to say. It's very powerful to have these kinds of suggestions. Anyone doing any kind of planning, you can have the AI spit back to you a bunch of stuff you might not have thought of. And so I think this is something which could definitely apply to the design process, any design process, but especially type design. And so that demo was made using GPT-3 from OpenAI. And I just saw this tweet the other day that GPT-4 is rumored to be coming out soon. And this is a 500 times increase. So I think that in the next few years, we're going to see some very interesting new technologies coming through this kind of AI power. And I wonder what that will do to type design. So finally, I just want to wrap up with a couple more quotes. So Ursula Le Guin famously said, "We live in capitalism and its power seems inescapable, but so did the divine right of kings." And then David Graeber wrote in The Utopia of Rules that the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something that we make and could just as easily make differently. Thank you very much. All right. Well, that's good. You get back on time. So thanks everyone for listening, and hope to be there in person maybe next year.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Glenn. I'll see you soon. Bye. Thank you.